Hi class. Most of you by now should be done with creating your initial patterns in Illustrator, so I'm going to move on to the Photoshop portion of this project where you're going to be creating different colorways. This is the last pattern that I did, so I'll start with this one. The first thing you want to do is open Photoshop. Mine's down here. Once you open Photoshop, you're going to say File, Open, and you are going to find where you saved your patterns. Mine are on my desktop in a folder called Tie Project. I think they're working files. Okay, so it's the pagoda. That's the one I want to open. It doesn't matter if it's still open in Illustrator or not, because when you open it in Photoshop, what Photoshop will do is it will make it into a new file. It has to rasterize it. Photoshop is not a vector program like Illustrator, so it doesn't deal with the points, the anchor points, and the pads and that sort of thing. It deals with pixels. So if this is going to rasterize it and create a new file, it'll name it the same thing if you let it. It's 8.5 by 11, that's good. You want the resolution to be 300 pixels per inch. If it's less than that and if your pattern has tiny details, you're going to have a hard time keeping those details. The thing is with Photoshop, with any bitmap program or raster program, the resolution is it's resolution dependent. So if you start with a small resolution, you can never get a good high quality resolution. It's going to always be, crappy no matter what you do with it. So start with a high resolution. And 300 is pretty good. Oh, I forgot to move my swatches out of the way, but like I said, my tie is going to be cut out of the center here, so that won't get in the way. If your swatches are somewhere in the middle of it, you need to move them aside so they don't become part of it. So there's my first pattern. The first thing I have to do in Photoshop is I have to create the different colorways. I'm going to create each colorway on a different layer. So I'll end up with 4 different colorways, the original 1 plus 3 new ones. So I'll end up with 4 layers. If your layer menu is not already open, and if you don't see it over here with the little layer image, just like in Illustrator, a lot of the tools are similar. A lot of the menus are similar, even though it's a different program and operates differently. But like, for instance, under Window, you can find any menus that aren't open. My layers is already open, so you can see it has a check mark on it. But if it's not open, come down to Layers, click on it, and it'll open it up. So here's my first layer, which came in as a layer. The thing in Photoshop is it's much more important to have separate layers, because if I take, here's my paintbrush tool. If I take my paintbrush tool, let me make it a little bit bigger. And if I paint across here, it actually is like taking ink and drawing right on your drawing. I can no longer take my selection tool and grab parts and move them. It will move the whole, it's just one piece. Think of it as a quilt of pixels. So let me see, Command C, get rid of that. Edit, step backwards. All right, so that's why it's important to have separate layers. So usually what happens is when you copy and paste something into Photoshop, it automatically puts it on a new layer. But in this case, we need to make some new layers. So I'm going to come over here in the upper right-hand little corner here. I'm going to say new layer. Oh, actually, I'm going to say duplicate layer, because I want a new layer with the same artwork on. So instead of new layer, I'm saying duplicate layer. You can be whatever it wants to be. I'll duplicate it again. And I'll duplicate it one last time. So now what I have is 4 layers, and you can see the little image here. They look exactly the same. So I'm going to start on the first layer, because if I was working, and just like in Illustrator, the layer you're in, the active, has to be activated. If I were to work on this layer, well, this layer is covering it up. Think of it just as though it's a pad of tracing paper, and you've painted on top of this layer, so you can't see this layer through it. So just to keep from getting confused about what layer I'm on, I start with the top layer. You can turn layers on and off. Of course, you can't tell the difference since all the layers are the same. So if I turn this one off, it looks the same. But once we start painting them, you will be able to. The next thing I want to do is I want to bring in my swatches, because once again, I want to keep those same colors. So I'm going to come back to my Illustrator document. You can copy and paste between Illustrator and Photoshop. Copy, and I'll come back to my Photoshop, and I'll paste. Paste. I don't want a smart object. A smart object is trying to retain my points and anchors, which means I won't be able to see the color. I mean, I can see it, but I won't be able to really use it. I want it to be pixels. When you paste it in, click Pixels, say OK, and then you once you have this X there, you have to hit enter to really get it in there. So now one of the big differences between Illustrator and Photoshop is that in Illustrator, you can move your swatches to the side and see them. You can't in Photoshop. If you move them out here, you don't see things outside the pasteboard. But you don't really have to. I keep it up here where it's not really covering anything. And I can turn the layer off. It's on a separate layer, so it's not really going to get in my way. So I can turn it off by clicking that eyeball, turn it back on again. In this case, I want to leave it on so I can get those colors. So how am I going to change this? I could do several different things. You do not have to change every single color. I think in my setup here, I want to always keep the pagoda and these lines here in black. So maybe in this one, what I'll do is maybe I will change the sun or the moon or whatever it is. Maybe I will change it. Okay, I have to first move to this layer. So maybe I will change that to the gold. So in order to do that, I need to use the paint bucket. If you don't see the paint bucket, just like an Illustrator, there's a little triangle here. There's tools hiding underneath there. The paint bucket hides underneath the gradient tool, behind the gradient tool. So click and hold, and you get paint bucket. That's what you want. It looks just like a paint bucket. The paint bucket will paint with the color in the foreground. If you see right now I have black in the foreground. I don't want to paint with black. I want to paint with the gold. So I'm going to take the eyedropper tool, which works very much like it does in Illustrator. Click on that, click on my gold, and there it went in the foreground. So now if I'm in this layer, if I use my paint bucket tool and I click on that red, all the pixels that are that color red will change to gold. Now I want to change this gold to something else. Maybe, well, I'm going to change the sky to dark blue. So I need this dark blue. It's going to be a nighttime sky. It's going to be a moon and a nighttime sky. So I'm going to take my eyedropper tool. Once again, click on my dark blue, which puts it into the foreground. Use my paint bucket tool and click on the sky. And now I have, sometimes it takes a few minutes, a nighttime sky. Oops, it didn't make these little guys. So let me show you a trick. Let me get rid of that. If I want, if I click on it with the paint bucket, by default usually, this contiguous has a check mark on it. What that means is that it will only change pixel, it'll change every pixel that's that light color blue, but only if they touch each other. So when I clicked on here, it changed all of these, but these pixels don't touch those pixels, so it didn't change those. I could click one at a time on those, which wouldn't be too difficult, in this case. But if you have a polka dot pattern or some kind of pattern that's very complex with all kinds of little pieces of that color that you want to change to the other color and they don't touch or they're not contiguous, what'll happen is it'll take you a very long time. It's very tedious. So, whoops, I went forward instead of backwards. Backwards. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to uncheck the contiguous up here. If I uncheck mark that and then use the paint bucket and click on this blue, every single pixel in the entire layer that is that color light blue changes at the same time. So you have to pay attention to this little word contiguous up here, and it might be a symbol, but if you lay your cursor on it, it'll tell you what it is. Fill only contiguous pixels. You want to pay attention to whether it's check marked or not. Okay, so next, let me see. I think I'll make the ground, maybe I'll make it this light blue. Maybe it's water. Maybe the pagoda is over a lake. So I'm going to take my eyedropper tool, click on the light blue, it goes into my foreground, come back to my paint bucket, and I'm going to click on the ground. Oops. Now see, because I didn't have that contiguous check marked, it changed my sun too. So let me step backwards. In Photoshop, you can't keep going Control Z or Command Z. It only does one time, so you have to use the step backwards or the history menu. So I'm going to recheck mark that contiguous, meaning it'll only change touching pixels. And I'll try this again, and now I got the blue there. So now there's my second colorway. I'm done with that. That's all I want to do. So I'm going to turn that off, and I'm going to move down to this next layer. And I need to come up with a different colorway here. Perhaps here I will make my sky the medium blue. So I'm going to take my eyedropper tool, click on the medium blue. It goes in the foreground. Take my paint bucket tool. I want to take contiguous away because I want all of that light blue to change to medium, even what's inside here. So I just click on one of them. and they all change. Maybe I'll leave it that way with the red moon and the gold thing. You don't have to change everything. Like I said, you can just change the ones you want. You want to just change them enough that they look like a different enough pattern. If they look too similar, the store is not going to want to buy two ties that look almost the same, but not quite. So now I have one left. So I'm going to turn this one off. I'm going to move down to this layer. I'm kind of running out of ideas. Maybe I'll make this a gold sky for some reason. I don't know why. So let me go to my eyedropper tool, get gold in my foreground. I'm going to come to my paint bucket tool, and I click. Oops, now it made everything gold because the gold was touching the blue. Sometimes this happens. Let me step backwards. Sometimes that happens. So sometimes the best thing to do is to temporarily make this into some other color to hold it away from that color. So what I mean by that is this little arrow will swap the foreground and the background, just like an illustrator, it swaps the stroke and the fill. So I'm going to swap my foreground to white. Now I'm going to use my paint bucket tool. I'm going to come down to this layer. I'm going to change that to white. Then I'm going to swap it back to gold. And then I'm going to make this gold. And so now I have the ground white. Maybe I'll leave the ground. No, I kind of want to have the moon be white. I think I want the moon to... Well, no, I think I like that. So that's, I can use white on here, that's fine. So that would be my other colorway. Now, you know what, I'm going to put blue down here. You're the designer, you decide what looks good. Sometimes, you know, you have to kind of deciding on the fly. So the eyedropper tool, maybe I'll make it medium blue this time. And the paint bucket tool, and I will click on the white. Now it's blue. Okay, so there is my 4 different colorways. My original, the gold sky, medium blue sky, dark blue sky. I can turn my swatches off, I don't really need them. So that's all there is for this stuff. You've now made this particular step. You've now made 4 different colorways of your same pattern. So now you can move on to your next pattern. You do the same thing with all of your patterns. And that's all you need to know for this step.